Hello everyone, and welcome to His Author's Voice. I am the author, Jack Sanger. The story you're going to hear is called Heavenly Bodies, and I suppose it's an extension and projection of what is happening in reality television these days, where individuals hope to change their entire bodies, their psychologies, their characters into something better with the help of so-called experts. Where will it all end? I think you're about to hear. Heavenly Bodies. There were two winners of the new month's Heavenly Bodies lottery, funded by the independent TV series of that name. The female winner was Irma Bainbridge, age 39, from a back-to-back 2-up, 2-down in the northeast of England. The man's name was Eddie Buckley, aged 45, and he lived in a high-rise suburb of London. She had her legs ramrod straight and propped on their heels on the end of the bath. Every other bit of flesh up to her neck was covered in tiny, iridescent soap globes. Her body acted like a continuous child's wire hoop, churning out myriads of bubbles in one long exhalation as she fidgeted. She had good reason for this posture of concealment. Her legs were shapely up to her knees. The rest of her was a disaster. Flesh hung in the wrong places. Bristles sprouted from it like clumps of scrub in a desert. There were no taut muscles anywhere. Despite not yet being middle-aged, she looked as though the menopause had long disappeared from her rear-view mirror, leaving her breasts pendulous, as if some air had escaped from them, and her buttocks sagging in despair from lack of exercise. He wheezed fitfully as he ascended the marble steps, pulling himself hand over podgy hand, alpine style, by the rail. His t-shirt showed big circles of wet under the armpits, and its black and white checkerboard rectangle with a single red knight on a central square was pulled out of shape across the distension of his stomach, so that the chess-piece's horse's head appeared too small and its base too big. His denim Bermuda shorts gave way to white legs, fat and straight, as undefined as mushroom stalks. On his flat-footed feet, his carefully chosen, luminescent yellow trainers looked just like flat irons. Her face, once sporting a long-nosed patrician haughtiness, had slowly filled with soft pink sediment from a constant diet of sugar and carbohydrates, so that it bore an expression of unchanging blandness, incapable of presenting unambiguous emotion. Her eyes had lost their blue clarity and become lost in the cream of her corneas. Her hair was mottled from ineffectual dyeing and hung in a bad topiary around her temples, too long for her prematurely aged appearance, too short for her actual years. His face was mottled with early liver spots, the flesh folded round his eyes, narrowing them in padded shutters so that their flecked browns were virtually hidden from the world. He had been obese since primary school, so he had no notion of what he might have looked like had he come from a different home and a never-ending diet of takeaways. He could not recall any woman looking upon him with even passing interest. Instead, female eyes hardly rested upon him, as if his fatness exuded a slick of glistening oil that made their gazes slide off. Angled like a miniature shrine where the primrose tiles of the wall met the white surround tiles of the bath, Irma's winning ticket seemed to generate its own light. It was a portal to a promised land of celebrity, where the inevitable approbation and barely disguised desire of an addicted audience of millions would watch. She projected scene after scene on the screen of her imagination, in which she magnetized the lens of a following camera and fed its insatiable needs with her new-found beauty. Whether in a supermarket or wine bar or merely strolling down a salubrious, airy high street, eyes would follow her. Tongues would wag. Men in suits would nod admiringly and even raise an eyebrow inquiringly, discreetly, perhaps straightening their ties or brushing back their hair in their unconscious, genteel lechery. She would, for the first time in her life, and utterly at home in it, wear a red dress, cut above her knees and flaunting the hourglass curves of her sculptured form. Below her slim ankles, her steel heels and animal print leathers would click against the pavement rhythmically, enticingly. Eddie Buckley all but collapsed in the sole armchair of his small flat and contorted himself with a desperate grunt to filch his wallet from the pocket where it was squeezed tight by the overhanging encumbrance of his belly. He fumbled it open and pulled out the confirmation of his success in the lottery. He held it close to his eyes as if he was short-sighted. He liked it all blurry and out of focus before gradually extending his hand so that the words coalesced in the magical gold letter pronouncement. This month's male winner, Mr. Eddie Buckley. They would announce his name on the next programme. There would be a trailer about him to whet the appetite of the viewers. His grossness would be pored over by medical experts. His gasping lungs, his blood pressure, his inflated organs, his narrowing blood vessels, his smell, his flaccid skin, his impotence, his zilch life expectancy. The proximity of death was the real cliffhanger that ensnared audiences. This would accentuate the great miracle of his transubstantiation from dough to sinew, from miserable maggot to magnificent man, from villainous corpulence to heroic vibrancy. The consequence of weeks of comprehensive internal and external engineering, each step on the way publicly documented in intimate detail. And when he stepped off the conveyor belt that had taken him along the medical corridors of the programme's high-tech hospital, he would be recognised by one and all, invited to parties of the famous, interviewed daily by the media, and inundated with emails and tweets requesting his sexual services. A taxi came for Irma, trailed by a car, with a camera on its roof. Inside, pressed against her space-demanding body, was the presenter from the show, Juju John, a bizarrely charismatic black individual from Ethiopia and of no fixed gender. She was untroubled by her floundering size, stroking her constantly, cooing to her, building up her confidence, making her feel she was the queen of everyone's dreams. When they reached Newcastle Airport, a lens caught every logistical problem of getting her into the helicopter, Juju helping to lift her bulk from behind, up the narrow steel ladder, and finally through the hatch. And there they sat, Juju, the cameraman, and Irma Bainbridge, behind the pilot in his uniform with his array of instruments, sailing through the clouds, over the bridges of that great city, over the Angel of the North, and arrowing south towards London. He'd never been in a stretched limo. He'd never, ever been in a car with darkened windows. He'd seen them on the television programme. They were the favoured conveyance of the show's monthly lottery winners. Being inside one began to make it all feel real. He'd been escorted down the steps of his block of flats by Angel Delight, the exquisitely beautiful, platinum-haired, white-limbed, karate black belt, Italian accented show hostess in her tight, cleavage-revealing silver bodice and gold lame miniskirt. Now she sat facing him, her surreal long legs crossed, yet revealing her panties, her eyes only for him, perfume wafting between them, making him dizzy. He had already become unfazed by the cameraman in the passenger seat, capturing each skin pore of his delirium. Like horses being got ready for the paddock at Royal Ascot, they were hosed down and massaged, given knickers and Y-fronts emblazoned with the programme's logo to cover their genitalia, and covered in short white silk dressing gowns. Not far away they could hear the studio audience being warmed up by a comedian. It was booing, hissing, laughing and groaning in turn. Finally Juju John and Angel Delight led their respective charges up the rear steps to stand behind a closed curtain. "And now, the moment you've been waiting for," boomed an amplified voice. Cheers and whistles broke out beyond the drapes. "Juju John and Angel Delight will bring on our next two brave patients." The curtains swung apart, revealing them at the top of the steps. They glanced across at each other self-consciously and gave weak smiles, and then turned to the rows of cheering voyeurs. The inevitable adrenaline rush took over, which, when added to the triumph of standing there at last, on the other side of the TV screen, gave them an overpowering sense of invincibility. Irma and Eddie straightened. Their eyes flashed in the lights. Their plump arms raised and fisted the air, and then Angel and Juju slipped off their dressing gowns, holding them like their boxing seconds. "Ooh!" screamed the audience. "God!" many gulped. "Wow!" said some, covering their mouths. "That's not nice," muttered one or two. "Gross!" cried others, shutting their eyes for extra effect. But though they heard it and knew it would come, for they were addicts of the show, Eddie and Irma stood resolutely in the spotlights, the fresh blood of celebrity coursing through their veins and giving them the strength of zealots. The initial introduction ended with a powerful, muscular man and a lean and tanned woman stepping out of the shadows in skimpy, elasticated, sequined satin to stand on each side of them. They were carrying a sword each, like Roman gladiators inscribed with their names. The programme called the blades the Swords of Honour. They could be auctioned for thousands on the internet. This would be what Irma and Eddie would look like in 6 months. It seemed inconceivable, but that was the enduring lure of the show. Compliantly they stood as the doctors came to them one at a time, offering their prognoses based upon what could be seen by the naked eye and felt by the probing finger, all to be verified by tests in the hospital before surgery, drugs, diet and exercise over the next 6 months would bring about miracles. Even without attaching halos, the two would become conveyor belt angels, symbolizing all that was desirable in the world. They would undergo the pain and pleasure of experimental and traditional allopathy, homeopathy, acupuncture, colonic irrigation, surgery, electrocranial stimuli and Chinese herbs. Everything would seem to bring about beneficial change. Advertisements for the practitioners' centres for these techniques would run along the bottom of the TV screen with contact details. It was estimated that for every treatment demonstrated on the programme, thousands of sudden converts would set the ether fizzing with requests for appointments and demands for over-the-counter internet products. GP surgeries would be inundated with irate patients wanting novel medical procedures. There was a huge population of huge people out there, and the programme had developed the crude art of stampeding a large proportion of them to take up their smartphones and laptops and become consumers. The 6 months would be an ordeal, an epic odyssey into visceral torture, emotional extreme, rational despair, an unending attenuation of disenfranchised time, where their puppeteers moulded them every day, stringing them up and jerking them before unflinching lenses. Viewers could follow their every second of reconstruction on live cam, as well as the effects of the process on defecation, urination, and masturbation. Part of the contract that Irma and Eddie signed involved regular sex checks to see whether their libidos were being raised from ground zero. Self-manipulation was central to this, hands working unwilling flesh. Electrodes showing in red the tiny localized, stimulated pleasure centers on the maps of their brains, expanding as the pair reconnected their neuronal pathways and set going once dried up streams of hormones. Actual orgasms were still a long way off. Or they could watch the evening summary, where 24 hours experience was edited down to 10 minutes to take its place alongside the highlights of 5 other pairs at different stages of rehabilitation. They would weep in the gym, verbally abused by their trainers. They would moan in their cells at night as the hormones in their guts screamed for sustenance. They would laugh hysterically at former footage of themselves in before and after sequences. They would grimace and shake and yawn and squeal, all in HD colour close-up. Meanwhile, charts of their vital statistics would be in a constant flow of changing values: weight loss, BMI, muscles bulking, heart pulsing, blood pounding, nerves sensing, liver clarifying, kidneys filtering, and their corpuscles at war. Among all the couples, Eddie and Irma immediately became the fans' favourites. It was because, unlike all the others, these two had absolutely nothing to recommend them at the outset. They were less than nobodies. Other than their lifelong accretion of weight, they had nothing worth recounting in their biographies. They'd not been abused by their parents, they'd not needed to be taken from their homes or had had to run away. They had managed to find accommodation for themselves and procure full-time jobs. Irma as a care assistant in an old people's home, and Eddie stacking shelves with a forklift. They told no jokes and had no escapades to reveal under pressure. They were tabula rasa, heavy-footed vessels carrying infinite databases of the utterly trivial. "Do you know," said a white-coated psychologist into the camera, after looking slyly sideways at them both during the first week of their participation, "Irma and Eddie may well be unique to this show. Their brains are quite primitively developed, intellectually speaking. The consequence is that neither of them has a personality to speak of. I suggest that for the first time on Heavenly Bodies, we create personalities for them." Viewers, he stared deep into the camera, and so deep into living rooms. Write to us or send us an audio recording of what kind of people you would like Irma and Eddie to be. Winners will have a year's anytime drop-in ticket to the show. What do you say? There were hoops and hollers and stamping and clapping from the studio audience. And the suggestions poured in. A special panel sifted through them. There was a remarkable similarity in the narratives so that the successful scripts were truly representative of the wishes of the mass. The winners were announced a month into the pair's rehabilitation. Personality programming commenced exactly halfway through the 6-month project. It was a little crude, admitted the psychologists, but needs must, and it would be refined in due course. Thus, every day now, on top of the exercise, the cosmetic surgery, the fat-dissolving chemicals and the special diet, the unclothed pair would enter individual tanks of warm water in oxygen masks and float there in utter darkness, oblivious of any tactile sensation. Electrodes led from plastic caps fitted tight to their skulls to monitor displays in the psychologist's control room. A database had been created for each of them, converted into growing maps of their new biographies. From childhood to the present moment, they implanted new images, events and feelings, patterned around a central thread of logic, an integration with the temporoparietal cortex changes that were taking place, holding the emergent personality and body image in stable union. The more the new histories played upon their psyches, the hungrier the psyches became to learn more, become more, metamorphose more. The deeper they were aware of their new selves, the faster their bodies reached towards the final goal of perfectly sculpted hero and heroine. Eddie's script was that of a warrior, crime-fighting vigilante, taking law and order into his own hands in the battle for good over evil. Irma's was an eco-activist sworn to topple the global corporations that were wreaking a terrible toll on the planet's resources and vitality. It was by far the most popular innovation in the programme's 5-year domination of TV listings. Eddie and Irma were just like superheroes in cinema and games consoles. The viewers were transfixed, identifying with these miracles forming before them. They were the sole subject of conversation around the water dispensers. Men urged Eddie on as he climbed to the pinnacle of invincibility. Women cajoled Irma, a symbol to every one of them, to become Eddie's warrior equal, the faceless multinationals that controlled every aspect of their lives to be ground under her heels. If you pressed the red button on your remote or activated it by voice, you could scroll the life histories of Eddie and Irma down the side of your monitor on TV screen in ornate gold font on a pale blue background interspersed with authentic-looking family and other photographs documenting their life histories. On them, there were no references to their previous sluggish selves. You had to press another button to follow the real timeline of the last 6 months. Very few people did this now. Viewers wanted to bask in the reincarnations and imagine themselves in their place. Everything was so perfect. Golden childhoods, early precocity in walking, speaking, manipulating objects, self-teaching with computers as only true geniuses can, becoming leading athletes and games players with wonderfully developed intellects, university successes, sexual conquerors, and military heroes with victories over enemies in hand-to-hand combat. Then the gradual change to a mature moral sensibility and their decisions to become champions of the downtrodden, activists for a more equal society. Heavenly Bodies was unabashed at promoting them in this radical light given the through-the-roof ratings. They were onto a winner. What viewer could see any contradiction between the unethical conduct of the program's sponsors and what it was purveying. Consumption was king. Throughout the intense decimation of the old and layer-by-layer construction of the new, Irma and Eddie hardly spoke to each other. There had been little opportunity. Such was the media scrutiny. Their first opportunity to do so was on the eve of their final appearance on the programme, where they, in their turn, would step out of the shadows to stand next to new contestants, visibly demonstrating the before and the after of pathetic losers alongside virtual gods. Eddie looked at Irma's taut curves in appreciation. "You look a dream," he murmured, a seductive undertone to his flattery. Irma looked at Eddie's 6 feet of restless vitality. "You're a hunk," she said, her lips slightly apart, her face turned up to his, her breast rising and falling. Viewers on live cams sat up. On the sidebar of their screens, the maps of the pleasure centres in Eddie and Irma's brains were being suffused with red. As the two drew together to kiss, smartphones clogged their service providers and alternative TV channels became instantly deserted in favour of the channel that hosted heavenly bodies. As Eddie's and Irma's hands started tearing off clothes, there was a break for advertisements. Millions around the world rushed to their toilets during the interval. Kettles were switched on. The surges that followed blew the electricity substations and sank the water reservoirs a good 3 feet. The screens went blank. The studio cameras sighed and died, and stagehands with torches and mobile phones were the only ones to capture the pumping bodies of Eddie and Irma as they gasped and grappled, half naked, on the dressing room floor. Uploaded, once the systems had been steadied, the images went viral on the internet. Somehow the silhouetted footage was more erotic than anything the programme producers could ever have imagined in their most fetid dreams. Now, before the biggest viewing audience ever recorded, the final airtime of Eddie and Irma's climb to Mount Olympus was to be screened. A global audience had been hooked into the British channel. News stations were all operating live feeds. Eddie and Irma stood at the top of the steps at each side to be hidden by the curtains, even when they swung open to reveal new patients in their short silk drapes. Doctors waited at the bottom of the steps, ready to make their early pronouncements of the ailing condition of the diffident pair. Juju John and Angel Delight stood attentively at their shoulders. The presenter's voice boomed. The crowd screamed and stamped and beat their fists on the back of the chairs in front of them. Tension mounted to a climax as the curtains opened. The new patients stood bent back in front of them, awkwardly wringing their hands to boos and catcalls. "We want Eddie and Irma," the watchers chanted. "Eddie and Irma! Eddie and Irma!" Finally, at a nod from the producer, the hero and heroine stepped into the spotlight to wild pandemonium, dressed in skimpy, elasticated sequined satin. They were straight-backed and imperious. Their oiled torsos gleamed in the lights. Their hands gripped their swords of honour, pointing them to the sky. Their eyes seemed to capture and hold every single gaze of the studio audience and the viewers around the world. An expectant silence descended. Eddie looked at the fat, palpitating man beside him, and Irma at the rotund woman with downcast eyes. His head was full of his history from extraordinary childhood to magnificent maturity. Hers was just as crammed with the events in her life that had brought her to this point, and overriding it all was her hatred for the faceless rich that controlled nation-states and sucked the life force from the poor, using programs such as heavenly bodies to further their evil ends. "Can we change these into these?" thundered the presenter, pointing at the corpulent white and the muscle-hardened bronzed. Usually there was a wholehearted stamping response of "Yes!" from the audience, who wanted the miracle to occur over and over again. But in the silence controlled by Eddie and Irma's eyes, there had been a palpable change. A cold anger blew across the watching faces. "No!" screeched a solitary female voice, cutting through the pregnant air. "No!" took up the whole audience. "No! No!" Eddie and Irma looked at the two figures between them and felt a blood-freezing revulsion. Somewhere lodged deep they remembered that this was how they had once been, hapless beings without virtue or reason for existence. The sight was too much for them. Something snapped. As one, they swung their swords of honour. Two crimson fountains rose into the air, and two heads arced to thud upon the canvas-covered boards before rolling across the stage and dropping at the feet of the front row. A great cheer of exultation rose and reverberated among the steel roof beams. It seemed to last for an eternity. And that was Heavenly Bodies. I hope you enjoyed it. There are many more short stories, novels and plays, and even some non-fiction to be found on my website, www.jacksanger.com. I hope you go there and download whatever interests you. In the meantime, perhaps you could pass this podcast on to friends. The more the merrier, and the better known I'll become for this new venture of mine. Thank you. Bye-bye.